Once in royal David's city stood a lowly cattle shed, where a mother laid her baby in a manger for his bed.
Good evening. Will you join me in a cold church this evening for a warm purpose? And that is a discussion of the thing that, to me, makes Christmas Christmas. Well, apart from the birth of our Lord, which is music. This Christmas is going to be different in many ways for many people, but for me, the big thing that will be missing is that this place will not be full of a glorious sound of a whole congregation belting out their favourite carols. Our church life has been intertwined with singing. Right from the earliest days, St. Paul himself with his friends in jail sings a psalm of praise. And the earliest Christian celebrations have been marked with singing. So I thought, in the absence of our ability to sing together this Christmas, it'd be interesting to have a look, it'd be interesting and maybe even entertaining, to have a look at the traditions and music that make Christmas as we know and love it. And I want to start with one hymn, one song, one piece of Christmas music, which pretty much threads us from the earliest days of organised worship and singing right to the present day. So let's go back, all the way back to 350, 360 AD, to a man whose name was Ambrose of Milan, who wrote a song of protest and praise. He was writing a song against the heresy of Arianism, which said that Jesus was a sort of lesser version of God than God the Father, which doesn't get my blood boiling just at the moment because I didn't have to live through those times, but there were riots in those days. It was a big, big issue. So Ambrose wrote a song, not a song against Arianism, but a song in favour of his own version of the Trinity. A beautiful hymn. But the problem was, in those days, it wasn't that common to sing together. You see, if you had a long string of words, you had a long string of a tune. Because tunes didn't repeat, they just kept on going. If you look at the Psalms, they're not in metre, which means that each word has to have a different note. And so the longer the psalm, the longer the tune. So Ambrose, well, he either did something extraordinary or copied somebody else who had done it, but either way, this hymn was the first ever hymn we have in metric verse. That is, it's the first piece of music where you have different sections of words sung to the same tune. So one tune and different verses. It stayed in the repertoire because it's a perfect Advent and Christmas hymn, welcoming Jesus into our lives. It's called Veni Redemptor Gentium, O come thou Redeemer of the world. It would have been sung in lots of different ways with voices and instruments, and we still have the words and almost certainly the original tune from 350 AD. It's hauntingly beautiful, and when you hear Claire sing it just now, just think that it was sung back those 16, 17 centuries ago. And what you're hearing is likely to have been heard by those people whose lives may very well have been different from our own, but whose God was the same. So that was the first ever hymn, the original plain song, but it got changed over the years and over the centuries. We don't think of plain song as changing, but remember, this wasn't designed for singing in church. That was something very rare. You didn't tend to sing hymns in church, and when you did, it wasn't the congregation who sang them. It was the choir, or the monks, or the group of priests, or whoever. Singing carols and religious songs was something that you did in a group or in a family or in a house or in a pub or elsewhere, but mainly when you were dancing. When you gathered together, you sang religious songs. Most of the traditional songs that we know are dance tunes. For example, even the national anthem, which we sing at a bit of a dirge, was a form of dance called a galliard, which is quite a vigorous dance which involves lots of leaping and hopping. We tend to hear it like this. But actually, it would have sounded originally more like this. You can just imagine the Queen and Prince Philip galloping away to that, can't you? So one particular type of dance wasn't a galliard, but a chorale, a circle dance, like dancing around the maypole or just dancing in a circle. And because carols were designed, or chorales were designed to be sung as you dance, they have a sort of jerky rhythm that your feet make as you're moving sideways. So all carols tended to have that rhythm. So in particular, an actual Christmas hymn, maybe something like Once in Royal David City, but a Christmas carol has that characteristic jerky rhythm. For instance, and so that is what happened to our hymn Veni Redemptor Gentium. It was given a new coat of paint and a new tune. Veni Redemptor Gentium became translated as Come Thou Redeemer of the Earth. And although we sing it at a slow and stately way in church, it's still the same tune. Interestingly, when carols were brought into the church into the 17th and 18th centuries, they were made much less dance-like and more sombre, a bit like that. In the great Victorian shellacking of music, the tune for Come Thou Redeemer of the Earth was also used for a different carol, and the jerky rhythms were smoothed out, and that carol became unto us is born a son.
Unto us a boy is born, King of all creation. Give it to all follow, the Lord of every nation, the Lord of every nation.
Rather to my embarrassment, I didn't even realise that was the same tune until it was pointed out to me. So, yes, carols, indeed congregational hymns, were not introduced into church in this country until the 17th and 18th centuries. They were first introduced in the Reformed Church by Luther, and Luther loved old hymns, particularly this one, Veni Redemptor Gentium. He liked it so much he translated it into German and arranged the plain song into a congregational chorale. It became, in fact, one of the most famous German chorales ever, and it still is famous in Germany. Its name is Nun komm den Heiland, Heiland. And Luther himself wrote the tune, his version of the plain song, as well as the translation. And because it's not only a cracking tune and a famous hymn of rebellion, Bach started playing with it. And so you get some of Bach's most famous organ works and a cantata based on that very tune, that original plain song, written by Ambrose in 360 AD or thereabouts. It's astonishing to me that all this work outside the church was preserved by people singing and dancing and playing their instruments and was eventually brought into church. One way of preserving these tunes, of course, was writing them down, and that's what one elderly schoolmaster in Finland did in 1582. The height of the Reformation, of course, but somehow music escaped being labelled as Catholic or Protestant, and when Jacobus Finno, as he's known, or Jacob from Finland, published Pie Cantiones Ecclesiasticae et Scholasticae Varium Episcopulum, I should really know that word, the English translation is Pious Ecclesiastical and School Songs of Ancient Bishops. That text was regarded as a songbook rather than a theological statement, which is pretty good going because a lot of the songs are very Roman Catholic in flavour, very sort of Marian and very looking back to those old ways. Many of them are high medieval songs. So what do we know that comes from that book? Loads, absolutely loads of our Christmas carols come from that book, which again is a preservation of medieval carols. In Dulce Jubilo, Good Christian Men Rejoice, which again is the same tune, Of the Father's Heart Begotten, Good King Wenceslas, Unto Us is Born a Son, Gaudete, Gabriel's Message, Angelus ad Virginem, and, as they say, many, many more. All of those hymns are written in that one book, preserved by that one person, an elderly headmaster who saw the world changing around him and decided to preserve the songs he had danced to as a child. Thank you, Jacobus Finno, for giving us at least part of our Christmas. Back in our country, hymns were pretty biblical in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they were played by the West Gallery musicians, a group of instrumentalists and singers who accompanied services in the Reformed churches of Britain. Actually, some of the best information we have about this time is from literature and art. About these West Gallery musicians. They flourished from about 1700 until about 1850, and they played secular music in the pub on a Saturday night, and then tired and yawning they came into the church and played the sacred music there, and the tunes were often the same. They're mentioned by George Eliot in Scenes from a Clerical Life, in Samuel Butler's The Way of All Flesh, most of all in Thomas Hardy, perhaps because Hardy had fond recollections of them. Thomas Hardy's dad, also called Thomas, was a cellist in the West Gallery at Puddletown in Dorset. He had a book of secular songs, which was one of those reverse books where you read the songs that way and then turned it upside down and read them that way. And the other way was all the religious songs, all in the cello parts, of course. The books are still preserved and they're dated about 1800. Hardy wrote a number of short stories which included the West Gallery musicians, the Mellstock Choir, if you remember them, including where the musicians were a little bit tired from their exertions the night before and they all fell asleep until the priest pronounced the next hymn. They woke up and automatically broke into a rendition of a rather gaudy and bawdy song, and the priest and the prior was so disgusted that they bought a barrel organ to be wound up, quote, by someone of good and sober standing. And so Hardy writes, the old players played no more. So the West Gallery musicians were replaced by the so-called Kister whistles, and there were other changes made to the churches too. In the Anglican Church, the success and the revival of the church was largely through cathedrals. And so the churches were changed so that each church began to look like a mini cathedral. This place here, the place in which I'm standing, where the choir is, wasn't there originally. It was added on later to have a choir stalls and a high altar, so it looked like a cathedral. And it was at this point, with the relaxation in what could be sung in churches and the loss of the Puritan grip on the church, that Christmas as we know it began to take its form. Because all those hymns that weren't allowed to be sung in church were now allowed to be sung. Partly it was Prince Albert, partly it was Charles Dickens, and partly it was a whole variety of musicians who had a determination to make Christmas a joyous choral musical celebration. And it's in this era, of course, that we get most of our familiar Christmas carols. For instance, Mrs. C.F. Alexander, that redoubtable woman, decided to write a series of hymns to instruct and illustrate for children the Creed. One of those, illustrating the line, "The maker of heaven and earth and all things visible and invisible," became "All things bright and beautiful." Another one describing the line, "He was crucified under Pontius Pilate," became "There is a green hill far away." But one line which described the "Who for us and for our salvation came down from heaven" became "Once in royal David's city."
Was in royal David's city stood a lowly cattle shed, where a mother laid a baby in a manger for his bed.
Once in Royal David City is perhaps that hymn that most of us get the tingle down the spine when we hear, because it signals something about the beginning of Christmas. A candlelit church, a solo choir voice, and the service in which we find that began in 1879 by a newly consecrated bishop in a newly consecrated diocese. The new bishop of Truro, which was a new diocese then, was called E.W. Benson. He went on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was the father of E.F. Benson, the author. Now, there are several books about the Bensons. They're a remarkable family, and I do recommend you give them a read. But Benson was a pragmatic as well as a spiritual man, and he devised a service for Christmas Eve, which was to start at 9:30, and the purpose of it was to stop people going to the pub before midnight mass and coming in drunk. So he gave the service so that people could have something to do before midnight. And the service was to consist of 9 lessons and 9 carols. And the format has stuck to this day. Now, you know, I could go on about every single carol. I love hymns and carols, and I love learning about them. If you have a favourite carol that you want me to bore you with, I probably know more about it than you want me to tell you. But let me leave you with this thought. When we sing our carols, we are joining a song of praise which stretched back not just in sentiment and in devotion, but in actual words and tunes, back 17 centuries. Long before anything we know was built, long before our towns and cities, long before our cathedrals and churches, long before even than St. Cuthbert, who in 650 AD walked around this town. Long before that, our first Christmas carol was being sung. And we still sing it today.